morning, and welcome to our Underground Storage Tank Advanced Topic Workshop. I am Pearl Bolter, and I am the manager for Orange County Environmental Health in their Hazardous Materials Surveillance section. Many of you know, and you see our inspectors out there quite frequently during the year. We do the Underground Storage Tank program for all of Orange County, with the exception of 4 cities, which are Anaheim, Orange, Fullerton, and Santa Ana. I'm excited that you are willing to come out and spend a few hours of your time, and I know it's important time that you have to actually learn a little bit more about underground storage tank topics, and also to learn a little bit about our portal, which is our regional portal that we are unveiling over the next few years. Those are both exciting topics and interesting and important to you guys as far as giving you more information to make sure that you can get into compliance, and that's really our goal. We love to actually give you as many tools as you can to get you into compliance, or to make sure that you can deal with the many regulations and requirements that you have to deal with as underground storage tank owners and operators. And we understand it's not an easy task, and we want to do as much as we can as a regulatory agency and also as an educational outreach agency to do that. And so, yes, we are the CUPA for all of those cities, and we are the underground storage tank oversight agencies. And so during this workshop, we will have the chance to hear from Tim Erickson from Tate, who basically was with us about over a year ago when we did a basic underground storage tank workshop. And so this is the second in that series. So at the time, we received evaluations which basically led us to this second workshop, because you asked us to give us more advanced information on underground storage tanks. And so that's why we're here today. And so we ask you, and with the evaluation, to be as detailed as possible to let us know what we can do more for you in order to help you understand what you need to do as underground storage tank owners and operators. So today's workshop will be in 2 parts. The first part will be with Tim Erickson from Tate doing advanced UST monitoring, and the second will be basically giving you a demo of our portal. And I'll be up front right now with you as far as the portal, and saying that we are transitioning this portal over the next few years. Our deadline, of course, is 2013, where the state said we had to be electronic by 2013. Many of you will see it before that, because your city will be going ahead of some of the other cities. And so our CUPA is a CUPA of 10 participating agencies with us, and so that's 10 fire agencies. And so each of those fire agencies have to connect to our regional portal in order for those forms to be active and available for those businesses in that particular city, or, as in the case of the fire authority, for those cities that they oversee. And so we ask your patience as we transition this over the next few years. Many of you will have, if you have multiple sites, some sites will come into the portal sooner than other sites. And so as we transition, we know that it'll be exciting for you not to have to send in paper anymore, and you'll be able to have hopefully a more streamlined approach and a more efficient review of your paperwork and your documents that you need to submit to us for compliance at your business. We will have a break, and so there are food and refreshments out there, and as well as restrooms and every other if you need them during the break or at any time during the presentations. So now I just want to transition to Tim Erickson. Just to let you know, this will be taped also, this workshop, and so if you have staff who couldn't attend or anything like that, at some point we hope to have this on our website, so it could be a training tool. And so we also hope to at some point transition to social media, so using YouTube as a method to give some educational videos out and stuff like that. And so as we move through this, we need your input to see, as I said before, what we can do best to help you. Alrighty, Tim, come on up.
Well, thank you very much, Pearl, and pardon the technical difficulties here. That seems a little better. Well, good morning, and Pearl and the whole team from Orange County Healthcare Agency, thank you for inviting Tate to participate in this event. We really enjoyed getting to be a part of the UST The Basics and helping to put together that guidebook and giving that presentation, which I guess was, gosh, a year and a half ago now, September of 09. And fun to come back today and talk about, this is we're going to address some hot topics and kind of create a, sort of a roundtable forum here and be able to discuss some things maybe in some more detail, whereas our last presentation really went into just the regulations themselves. It's really, and again, an honor for us to be a part of this. And we work at Tate with every Coupa and throughout the state of California and numerous regulatory agencies throughout the nation. And for those of you that are part of the regulated community here, you operate, bar none, in the most heavily regulated state in the union. I mean, without question. And the complexity of those regulations is, it creates a whole layer of challenges that you face as a business owner. And one thing that Orange County Healthcare understands, and we certainly do as a contractor and consultant, is it really takes a partnership between the agency and the regulated community and consultants and contractors like ourselves to make this thing work. And it's really refreshing that Orange County Healthcare has taken such a proactive stance on trying to assist the regulated community wherever and whenever they can. And I think everybody that came in here today got a copy of UST The Basics, and this is the guidebook that I mentioned and the presentation that we had back in the fall of 09. And this is really a progressive move on the part of the Orange County Healthcare to put something out to you in layman's terms, which essentially says, okay, so you've got a UST in Orange County. Here's what you need to do. And when you have to rely on dissecting Title 23 and Chapter 6.7 of the Health and Safety Code, it's a whole nother animal, and it's really nice. And I think, again, very proactive on the part of Orange County Healthcare Agency to put something out like this and to follow that up with presentations and opportunities like we're having today. So. Just want to talk just real quickly, as with everything that we do, safety is number one, and let's dive right into some introductions here. For those of you that aren't familiar with Tate, just to give you just a real brief background on who we are. Our founder was working for Standard Oil back in the early '60s in downtown LA, and at the time, really the opposite of what you're seeing today. There was just tremendous expansion in the petroleum retail industry, and to the point of, if there was an intersection, they were putting 4 gas stations there. And he saw an opportunity. The oil companies were looking for, really, all the things that the surveying, the engineering that needed to go into constructing these stations, and that was really the foundation with which our company was started. And so our roots back in the mid-'60s are really tied to the petroleum industry and tied to the tank industry. And then over the years as a surveying and civil company, many of our customers, as we got into the mid-'80s and tank testing came about, now had some new challenges that they had to, and new regulations to comply with. And we got into the tank business as far as testing is concerned, and the contracting side of things, doing installs, upgrades, removals, so on and so forth, and ultimately into the remediation side of it as well. So we've been very much tied to the petroleum industry since its infancy, and certainly in the last 20 years or 25 years now, as the regulations have become more and more complex, have been able to shepherd our clients, through those times, and we've learned a lot along the way. It's interesting. We're we're seeing now throughout the nation is a lot of the upgrade requirements and the things that you had to deal with back, say the '98 upgrades and so forth. You're really starting to see those things migrate throughout the United States now. We've got a couple of offices in Texas, and there are more tanks in Texas than any state in the nation. Just a little piece of trivia: 26,000 UST facilities in the state, and there are many of them that have not been, in touching base with TCEQ, which is their regulatory body. There's tanks out there that haven't been visited in 30 years in the state, and that's just jaw-dropping, and you'd never hear of that in the state of California, for sure. And so many of those challenges that you all faced 10, 15 years ago, we're starting to see those upgrade requirements and secondary containment and so forth migrate throughout the United States. So California is definitely a first mover on a lot of those things, and again, there's not another state that's more complex to navigate the regulatory waters, so to speak, than California.
So I believe we do have a mic floating in the audience. So if anybody does have any questions, and feel free at any point as we go through this, if you have a question. We have a relatively small group here today. Feel free to stop me, raise your hand, whatnot, and let's go ahead and get that out there. I think you learn so much from hearing other people's challenges and the uniqueness of their sites and their situations. And so please don't hesitate stopping me and asking questions. And I'm sure between Brenda and the agency and Brian and myself, we can get you an answer. And if we can't here today, we'll certainly follow up with one after the presentation. So a little bit about some of the things that we're going to talk about. We got together with Royce and the team there with Orange County Healthcare and just talked about maybe some topics that would be of interest to the regulated community and to follow on to our presentation that we gave about a year and a half ago. And we're going to talk a little bit about the designated operator program and get into a little bit more detail about that and really get into, are you getting the most bang for your buck with your designated operator? It's a program now that's been around, started in January of '05. So, got about 5 years under our belt with the program, and we'll talk a little more in detail about that. We'll discuss contractor selection and some considerations there. We'll get briefly into some tank closure options and just discuss and review those. We'll talk a little bit about vapor pressure and hydrostatic, or AB 2481 compliant systems, and answer any questions. And we've got a few hot topics to discuss. And then, as Pearl mentioned, we're going to transition into the eSubmit business portal. And again, talk about, definitely a progressive thing that the agency is putting together to make it easier for you as the regulated community to communicate with the agency. And we'll follow that up with a question and answer period. So before we get rolling, I think it would be nice just so I can get an idea of our audience here. Let's see, just by a show of hands, how many in the room are regulators, work for CUPAs or the PAs? Looks like maybe about a third, 25%, something like that. And I would imagine the rest of you are from the regulated community. Let's see, as far as, how about from the retail petroleum side of the house? Okay, great. And as far as commercial and industrial applications with USTs, whether that's a utility, maybe a municipality, okay, telecommunication, that type of thing. All right. Well, we've got a nice mix, and which is always good, and kind of get some different points of view as we move forward through the presentation today. And we'll start by talking a little bit about the designated operator program. And as you know, that is required by Title 23 of all UST facilities in the state. And there's a section in Title 23, Section 2715, that's deals exclusively with the designated operator. This is something that was a component of the SB 989 regulations, which brought about, of course, what's become synonymous with that Senate bill, right? The secondary containment testing. So a component of that was the bringing about this designated operator program, and it was really born out of concern that the folks that were operating UST facilities, and really driven primarily by the retail petroleum industry, that individual behind the cash register, maybe in some cases didn't have an appropriate level of training to respond to spills, overfills, what to do when that monitoring system went into alarm, and really that was the basis for the development of this regulation, is to ensure those folks had a proper level of training to be able to safely operate those facilities. And what came about from that is the designated operator program. And I think it's important to note, and that name designated operator creates some confusion because there is a Title 23 definition of an owner-operator. So sometimes we find that folks tend to confuse the two as the designated operator being the same as the owner-operator. And there is a definition in Title 23 for the owner-operator, and it is mutually exclusive. I mean, the owner-operator could be the designated operator. But that owner-operator ultimately has responsibility for compliance of that site. And the designated operator serves, may be that individual, but may serve as an agent of that owner-operator. And you as an owner-operator, you're ultimately going to be responsible for the compliance of the site and any notices to comply, so on and so forth. So that designated operator is merely your agent, your eyes and ears, so to speak, out there to assist you in that compliance effort. Now, the designated operator has to have a certification to perform that duty, and that's something that's accomplished by taking an ICC, which is an International Code Council exam, to become a designated operator. And maybe just by a show of hands, how many in the room have served that capacity for your facility? Do we have any designated? So we've got quite a few in the room here, so very familiar with that, and you're obviously familiar with the ICC exam. It is a 60-question open book exam that has to be taken every 2 years and covers a myriad of regulatory topics. Unfortunately, I'd have to say the exam maybe goes a little more into detail on things like cathodic protection and statistical inventory reconciliation, and maybe some things that are used by a very small percentage of the UST community. So it can be a little bit of a tricky exam to navigate, and but it is required of anybody that wants to serve in that capacity. Once that certification is achieved, and you as an owner and operator make that decision that this individual is going to be the designated operator for the facility, there is an owner-operator statement, or an owner statement rather, that has to be submitted to the local agency. And if that individual ever changes, then you have 30 days to resubmit and notify the agency of those changes. So that's just a little of the administrative requirements for the designated operator, and probably more of a review than anything. And let's really kind of get into the meat of discussing the designated operator, and again, trying to get that bang for your buck out of this individual. As I alluded to, the foundation of this is all about ensuring that those individuals that are operating the site have, those facility employees have the appropriate level of training to safely monitor the system, to know what to do in the event of spills, overfills. So a big part of the designated operator's role is providing that training for those individuals. And we'll talk about that a little bit in more detail here in a moment. The other component of that is a requirement for monthly inspections to be performed by the designated operator. And when the state put this together, the whole idea was this is something a business owner could do, and it's not supposed to be a terribly invasive inspection. It's primarily a visual inspection that's done off of a state form, and we'll talk and break down that inspection here in a moment and discuss that. And just as a footnote, what we're seeing now is maybe for those of you that work for companies that have facilities outside of the state of California, part of the Energy Act of 2005 that was signed by President Bush enacted operator training guidelines for the rest of the country. So what we're seeing right now is a lot of the, most all of the other states adopting programs that are similar to what California has. And that may just be the training component, but in some cases that also includes monthly or quarterly inspections as well. So much like I mentioned earlier, as tends to be the case, regulations that start here in California seem to migrate eastward across the United States, and we're seeing that right now. In fact, those states have an August 2012 deadline to implement similar programs in their respective areas. So let's talk a little bit about that designated operator role. And as I mentioned, there is a state checklist, and you can find that on the Water Board website. You can also find the information on the Designated Operator Program on Orange County Healthcare site, and we'll take a look at that here in a moment. And what we're going to cover here is the basics of the inspection, what's required by the regulation, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about additional roles that you could employ your designated operator to fulfill for you. So a component of the inspection is reviewing the alarm history. And in the case of this photo here, we've got a TLS 350 with a printer. An alarm history could be pulled up. There could also be a review of an alarm log if an alarm log is maintained at the site. And the idea is to take a look at the alarms that have occurred since the last designated operator inspection and ensure that those were addressed appropriately. Obviously, if there were let's just say a sump alarm and there's not any documentation that would indicate how that was handled, then that becomes a question as to whether was that handled appropriately or was a sensor lifted or some other means of getting that system out of alarm. And that's the foundation of this, is to establish a baseline of what has happened over the last month so we can determine that those things were handled appropriately. After taking a look at that alarm history for the month, and then we have the actual physical inspection of the site, which includes an inspection of under dispenser containment. What you see in this photo here is a kind of close-up of a UDC panel that's opened up. You can see you've got the shear valve right here, and they're using a piece of red thread there as purely as a guide to kind of hold the sensor upright and in position. If I were a betting man, I'd guess there's a Veeder-Root 208 sensor on the other end of that line there, sitting down in the low point of the sump. So the designated operator's role is to ensure that that UDC is free of debris, of liquid, and then at the same time that the sensor is in the appropriate location. And this is an area of risk exposure for the owner-operator because that UDC is fairly accessible, and there is always the opportunity there for somebody to make an inappropriate judgment call and raise or tamper with that sensor. So that's a big part of the designated operator's responsibility, is to ensure that that's in the appropriate position and in a place where it can most readily detect a potential leak within the dispenser there. As far as the sumps are concerned, inspection of those sumps is only required if there was an alarm that occurred during that month and there is not any documentation that would indicate that that was handled appropriately. So what you should see as you're reviewing that alarm history, let's say you had a fill sump alarm on a particular day during the month, and then as you looked through the binder, you noticed that there was a work order in there that addressed the issue. Maybe it was simply a rainwater pump out of the sump, or maybe there was a faulty sensor, but there is indication that that was handled appropriately. Now you have that documentation. You can tell what happened. You can tell that it was resolved by a appropriately certified contractor, and now the opening of that sump isn't required by the designated operator. If there isn't any proof that that was handled appropriately, then of course the next step is to be able to visually inspect that sump, much like you did for the UDC there. So it's a matter of opening up that sump, or potentially an observation port on the sump lid there, and taking a look at the presence of any water, debris, or other substance in the sump, and again making sure that that sensor is in the appropriate location. I mentioned the fact that culling through the binder to make sure that all the documentation is there. Some other things that you're going to be looking for are all the test documentation, and there are line items on the inspection form to ensure that the latest monitor certification, line test if that's required, SB989 results, ELD testing if that were required, or any other tests are present in the binder. And then lastly, verifying the employee training, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. And maybe this is a nice time to segue into, I keep mentioning this, binder and your records and the documentation. We're going to talk here in a moment about some of the top 10 type, reasons for being cited for a violation. And boy, and we see it over and over again as a contractor that more than anything, what bites folks out there is paperwork. It's the documentation. And boy, it's pretty voluminous, the amount of paper that's involved in maintaining one of these sites. And we'll see time and again that that's what gets folks in trouble, is maintaining and having that documentation on site. And again, I think it's great that the agency is kind of willing to assist in that, and one of the things that we find is most helpful is when sites implement some type of compliance binder. A lot of the large companies and major oil companies, have some type of binder that they use company-wide. But if you don't at your facility, I highly recommend you put that together. Boy, nothing will start out an annual inspection with the Coupa better than having all your ducks in a row, having everything organized in a binder, and having that readily accessible for the Coupa to inspect when they get there. And what OCHCA has put together here is just a very nice binder. I think everybody got a copy of one when you came in. There's a table of contents, and then all the different tabs for some of the types of documentation that you'd have in there. Your permit, your tank forms, Coupa inspection reports, financial responsibility, testing results, your MRP, your HMBP, a lot of those different forms and information that you've got to keep in there. And this is a great spot for that designated operator to come to find those work orders, for some, a service ticket for handling a sensor in that fill sump. Hopefully it's can be found right here in the binder. Go ahead, sir.
You still have to have a separate folder though for AQMD besides the DO operator, right?
The question was, as far as AQMD is concerned, and having a separate folder for your vapor recovery testing and so forth. Brian, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't experienced anything with AQMD where they have an issue of you keeping those records together as long as they're accessible to them and identified. There's while those aren't, necessarily discussed or mentioned in this binder, there's certainly a tab in there for testing and maintenance, and I think that would be, a logical spot for inclusion of your VR testing if you do have that for your facility. And in talking to AQMD inspectors, I think their issue is much like the Coupa inspectors. It's really a matter of just having that together, organized, and ready for them when they want to look at it. And to that end, we also serve as designated operators, outsourced designated operators for, well, it's varied over the years, but 600 to 700 sites throughout the state, and I think to date we've done about 40,000 of these inspections since the program's been around, and we've noticed that over the years that our clients have become very creative in trying to add value to the designated operator. They're paying for us to come out there. For us to be their eyes and ears, to be that third party that's coming out and helping them with their partner in compliance. And we've seen a lot of things added to this list. You mentioned vapor recovery testing. It wouldn't be unreasonable for you to expand the scope of your designated operator's monthly requirements to be more inclusive of other paperwork or documentations that's on the site. Maybe you have an AST on the site, you have SPCC plans, you have other things that, other documents and records that need to be maintained on site. And with a lot of our clients, they've opened that up, and we have full supplemental routines that we perform for them while we're out there doing that designated operator inspection. In some cases, we have one client that, a non-retail client, that has us do a monthly dispenser and hanging hardware check for them because they just wanted to, we're out there anyway, so let's take a proactive stance and, let's look at those things while you're there as well. Other companies have included things like ensuring, stickers are on the dispensers, or canopies, or other signage that needs to be on site is not damaged. So you really, if you're paying for somebody to come out there, or you've assigned somebody within your organization that role, there are a lot of creative things that you can do to add more value with your designated operator. Truly think of that individual as your eyes and ears. This is somebody that's going to take that, third party, or maybe within your organization, but that look at the site every month. So get the most bang for your buck you can with that, and don't be afraid to expand that scope. Of course, you have the mandated form that has to be filled out, but by all means, if you're paying somebody to come out and do that, don't be afraid to ask them to open that scope up and bring a little bit more value to the program. Of course, the form itself has a sections for listing follow-up action, and it's the designated operator's responsibility to get with the owner-operator and if there are items that require follow-up, to review them with that individual. And as with you see it with all the regulations, much like you're getting your monitor cert form into the agency within 30 days of the test. Well, that is something that maybe the contractor performs for you. At the end of the day, the compliance requirement, that falls back to the owner-operator. And same thing with the designated operator inspection. It's that owner-operator's responsibility to ensure that items that are brought up on this inspection are appropriately followed up on. We talked a little bit about the training as well, and again, that was really the foundation of the designated operator program. And the requirements that are in Title 23, you can see some of the things that it needs to include there. Operation of the UST system, emergency contact information, what to do in the event of a spill or overfill, and monitoring equipment operation and alarm response. And it does talk in Title 23 about best practices, and really those are, the procedures that you as an organization have in place to prevent spills, overfills, or unauthorized releases. And it's the designated operator's responsibility to make sure that the facility employees have that information and understand what to do with it. And we did a study at the end of year one for a major petroleum retailer, and to study kind of the effectiveness of what we were seeing from the first few months of the program to a year or so into the program. And one of the things that we saw was a marked improvement in keeping spill buckets clean, and some of the things that were a component of the training, and it really kind of drove home the fact that there is a value to this program, and it was having an impact on the compliance effort. And so this training, it's really important to make sure that everybody receives that. Of course, there's a requirement to document that training. Make sure that anybody new to the site that would be in that role of a facility employee receives that within 30 days. And if you have a site that is operating and you have folks dispensing or delivering product, there has to be at least one trained employee on site. I mean, obviously there are exceptions made for unmanned sites, and that is discussed in Title 23, but the requirement is to have all facility employees trained, but certainly have to have at least one facility employee trained during operations. And that creates a little bit of a management issue we've seen in that, especially with the retail sites, you have a high turnover in employees, and it's ripe for getting into a situation where, slower times you may only have one person there or a couple of people there, and if you've had some turnover, you could get into a situation where you have either the individual or individuals there have not yet received their training. And that's something that as an owner-operator you really have to be on guard for, and make sure that whoever manages your site and handles that scheduling understands these requirements, and make sure that you're scheduling a trained individual to be on site. As I mentioned before, we kind of got into documentation, and this slide was taken from our last presentation and is a component of UST the Basics, the manual you've got there. And I included it again this year because as I looked at it, the things that, most of the things on here, your designated operator could, provide a layer of, there's an opportunity for your designated operator to help keep you compliant with almost everything on here. When you talk about, a lot of these are documentation and paperwork issues. You can see financial responsibility, annual facility employee training, monitoring plan not submitted, DO monthly inspections not conducted or documented, testing results not being there or conducted. All of these are things, you've got this individual coming out to the site every month. Boy, these things should not fall through the cracks if that individual is doing their job every month and checking and making sure that, if something is missing out of that binder, boy, somebody took the financial responsibility documentation out of there, you need to get that reinserted. Use that designated operator and to his or her fullest extent, and I really think you can mitigate a lot of these, top 10 violation issues, which are really documentation centric. And I would say that for us, we spend an equal or more amount of time on the documentation side of things when we're out doing a designated operator inspection than we do on the physical site inspection itself. It's that's a fairly, as I mentioned, non-invasive visual inspection, but really, boy, where we feel we're bringing the most value to our clients is going through that binder in a very detailed manner and making sure everything's there. And if it isn't, we're talking to the appropriate folks and are pulling it up on their environmental database and printing it out and making sure it's included. But that documentation is, again, where the regulated community stumbles the most is in very documentation-centric issues. As I mentioned, OCHC website has some designated operator information that can be found. This is just a screenshot, but it's very easy to find when you go into the program section of the UST program. And you can see there's some frequently asked questions regarding the designated operator program. And it will go into what their duties are, how do they become certified, what do I need to do if they're not doing their job, and can you recommend a good designated operator? And that issue, and we'll kind of get into that when we talk about selecting an appropriate contractor. The agency, obviously can't necessarily, recommend one contractor or consultant over another, but there's a network out there in the regulated community, and I would encourage you to ask others that are in your same position. And I think it's fairly easy for you to establish who are some good third-party designated operators if you're looking for that. Of the folks in this room, I'd just be curious of the regulated community. How many of you handle that, by a show of hands, handle that designated operator role internally? And then how about third-party wise? Okay, so roughly half and half. And as I mentioned, whether you're doing it internally or doing it third-party, boy, especially if you're doing it third-party, really, think outside the box of how can those individuals. Heck, you're paying them to come out to your site and take a look at all this. How can you expand that scope and get more value from those individuals? Because there's, whether that's inspecting other things on the site, doing a more comprehensive documentation inspection, or whatnot. There's a lot of things you can do to, again, get more value out of that designated operator. And we'll talk a little bit in the next section, be more inclusive of just contractors in general, as far as some things that you should look out for when selecting a contractor. Anybody have any questions regarding the designated operator? And boy, if you do have something that comes up or questions or thoughts, more than happy afterwards to discuss that with you as we wrap up the presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about selecting of the right contractor, and that obviously is kind of tied into if you're outsourcing that designated operator as well. You're going to be faced with finding that who should you be working with out there in the industry, and the same applies for repairs and upgrades to your system or testing that has to be done. And there's some resources out there for you to help you make that determination. And I mentioned earlier that industry reputation. So obviously talking with others in the regulated community, I think it's pretty easy to establish companies that folks are comfortable utilizing. I will say that we have seen over the years that companies have come and gone in the industry, as we've hit different, peak times, whether there was, regulations that impacted that or whatnot. And the companies that have stuck around and had longevity in this business are ones that understand the importance of adhering to the letter of the law and safety requirements and so on and so forth. And I want to bring that up with respect to site safety, and it's a it's a big issue. I even with the designated operator, it's right now I think it's obviously been a very tough several years through this recession, and we certainly see it in when we go out for construction bids or remediation bids or whatever that might be. That things have become even more commoditized due to the recession, and you know, that's a lot of times becomes a bottom dollar driven, and those might be from pressures you know, on high in your companies or organization that are mandating that you know, lowest bidder or whatnot, and that's completely understandable. And but you know, it really sets up a you know, a situation where you really got to safeguard yourself that you know, who you've got out there working on the site is doing things from a safety standpoint like they need to be doing it, and because one thing that does happen out in the industry, unfortunately, is you know, there's the temptation for contractors to cut corners when it comes to safety. And you know, at the end of the day, you as an owner-operator, you know, have that obligation to keep that site safe for your employees, for the general public that might be your customers that are utilizing the site. And you know, many stories over the years of, you know, things that have happened on sites. You know, you've got you know, exposure to hazardous materials, hazardous vapors. You've got open sumps. You know, there's a lot of opportunity. You know, mix that in with, in some cases, a high vehicular traffic rate that are going through those sites while these things are taking place, whether it's a testing event or a designated operator inspection. And the situation is ripe for a you know, potential safety incident. And you know, many stories of, you know, get litigation involving a you know, a fly-by-night testing company or contractor that wasn't following those protocols, and something happens out on the site, and boy, they're bankrupt and out of business, and it's the you know, it's the site owner operator who's left holding the bag, or their insurance company, and getting involved in a you know, some type of litigation around an incident that took place on the site. And I just you know, really encourage you when you're making that selection of a contractor, you know, and those are things that you can query those contractors. You know, what are your you know, safety considerations when performing this, and making sure that when they're out there, the site is properly barricaded, proper PPE is being used, and that you're really you know, protecting your employees and your customers out there at the site. Along with that is, you know, not only is there the expectation that your contractors performing those tasks that you've hired them to do in a safe manner, but also that they're appropriately certified and trained to be out there doing those tasks. And we talked about the fact that there's a level of complexity certainly to the regulations, and there's a level of complexity to the certifications as well. And boy, we have a database that is pretty voluminous, keeping track of all of our regulations for our technicians. And you know, those include things, obviously there's contractors licensing requirements. So if you have somebody out either performing testing or doing any type of construction activities on the site, you know, they do have to have a work for a company that has their contractor's licenses. If it's a tank testing, there is a, you know, they can have a state-issued tank tester's license if it's testing that's being done in lieu of that contractor's license. And then there are the ICC requirements. We talked about the fact that the designated operator has an ICC exam that he or she needs to pass. The same is true for a UST installer or retrofitter, you know, someone doing construction work on the site. They have to have someone on site, a lead or foreman that has that certification. Same is true with testing. There's an ICC service technician requirement. And then also, as we discussed just briefly, you know, and we're not going to get into the vapor side of the house, but there are vapor recovery ICC exams as well that are required of those individuals. And we'll talk here in a moment of where you can go to verify that the contractor that's out there on that site actually has those certifications. And then lastly, there are a myriad of manufacturer certs that are required. So for various components, you know, if you're out there doing a monitor certification and you have a Veeder-Root system at your site, that individual needs to be have the appropriate level of Veeder-Root certification that comes from the manufacturer. If he or she are doing repairs, they may need to have a fill-tight or an OPW, or, you know, the actual manufacturer's training to be able to install or work on those components. So, and that is, you know, important and definitely something that during an annual inspection, the agency will typically ask us as a contractor to produce and verify that we actually have those certifications as we're out there on the project. Some places where you can go to take a look at that. This is a screenshot from the State Licensing Board website, and you can actually check a license. You can go right into, you can see I've inputted our company name down there, or a portion of our name, and you can hit search for licenses, and it'll tell you whether it's active, it's expired, the type of license that they have. And so that's a nice resource for you to be able to verify that. Also something you can require that contractor to produce proof of before you hire them as well. And then on the ICC website, there is a section where you can search for an ICC certified professional. So if you were to put in my last name as an example here and hit go, any ICC exam that I have that is current will show up there for you. So you can check on that as well. There's, with both of these websites, as you might imagine, there's some lag time in getting these things updated and so forth. But again, never hesitate asking that contractor to produce those for you. If they're out there on the site, a technician, a foreman, they'll be carrying their ICC certifications and appropriate manufacturer certifications with them. So don't hesitate requesting that they produce those for you. I'm just going to touch on tank closure options here a little bit, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of, especially we see it in utilities, telecoms, folks that are getting out of the fleet refueling business, in part due to the expense to keep up with regulations, and we're doing a fair number of tank pulls these days, and want to talk a little bit about those tank closure options that you have. It's interesting. Boy, the industry is littered with some rather kind of tragic stories. We've had just in the last couple of years, we've had clients that have come to us that have assumed the environmental liability for sites, purchased property, and had no idea that there was a abandoned or inappropriately closed tank on the site. And boy, the litigation nightmare that ensues from that, and the potential exposure to the cost of cleanup or mitigating that is tremendous. And so it's a something in the state of California, believe it or not, that still does happen from time to time. I certainly see that more outside the state. But let's talk a little bit about closing, whether it's temporary or permanently, these sites. And for a temporary closure, the concept behind a temp closure is that within a 12-month period, there's going to be a resumption of that stored hazardous substance. So what may drive that is, maybe it's a retail site and there's a major C-store renovation that's going on that's going to have the site closed for 3-4 months, or some other reason that would dictate putting the tank into temp closure. And when a tank is temporarily closed, and again, if that period of time is going to be beyond 12 months, by and large, that's going to put you into a permanent closure type of situation. But for a temp close, the hazardous substance is removed from the tank itself, and the tank is inerted if it contained hazardous vapors there, and everything's sealed off except for the vent piping, the required venting, and there are locking caps put on the fill and so forth. Power is disconnected from the system. If the tank's empty, it doesn't have to be monitored at that point in time. And one thing to be aware of, however, with the temp closure, and boy, is there anyone in this room that has a tank that has a cathodic protection system installed? All right, so if maybe an impressed current system? No? Okay. You're few and far between in the state of California anymore. But if you had something like an impressed current system, of course that requires that a rectifier is powered, and that supplies the current that maintains the corrosive protection for the system. In a case like that, that system would have to remain powered even during a temp closure, because obviously if you were to terminate power to that system, you no longer have that corrosion protection. The tank's still sitting in the ground, and in the case of a single wall steel tank in contact with the background, with the backfill there, that becomes, that's an issue. So once that, all those requirements are met, there's quarterly inspections that are mandated by Title 23. Those 90-day inspections are really to ensure that all of these provisions are still in place. That no one's monkeyed with the fill caps, no one's tampered with the system, that that everything, again, all those temp closure provisions have been met. Now, what we're seeing a lot of, as I alluded to, is the permanent closure. And by and large, for a permanent closure, there's going to be a requirement to remove the tank. And in order to do so, of course, the hazardous material has to be removed. The tank needs to be inerted, just like you did with the temp closure there. And then the tank's going to be properly disposed of. And that's going to require there's going to be a chemist that comes out and certifies that the tank's clean. There'll probably be some soil samples taken as the tank is pulled from the surrounding backfill. Ultimately, your contractor is going to put together a UST closure report that's going to include the results of that soil sampling. And the tank, of course, will be need to be disposed of properly as hazardous as waste. I did mention, and in some cases, the tank can be permanently closed in place. And really this is the exception rather than the rule. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brenda or Royce or anybody in the room, but really beyond there being an issue with, boy, if this tank is removed, either the piping or the tank is situated such that it could compromise the structural integrity of a nearby building or something along those lines, that's about the only reason that an agency is going to let you do a closure in place. I mean, Brenda, anything beyond that jumps out at you?
That's correct. And then normally we will ask for that there's a concurrence with the fire department as far as if that's an allowable abandonment, but you would have to remove all the piping and clean it and go from there. That's correct.
And oftentimes there may even be a provision that's written into that says, boy, if that if that adjacent structure that we're concerned about is ever removed, then you're going to have to pull the tank out of the ground at that point in time when that's no longer an issue. For a tank that is closed in place, as Brenda alluded to, the piping is removed and disposed of, and the tank is basically sealed and filled with a inert solid, usually a concrete slurry that the tank is filled with, and then you've just got a 20,000 gallons of concrete there under the ground, and it's closed right there in place. That's really I just wanted to kind of review that and discuss the basics of tank closure. And as I mentioned, relatively short topic here, but I want to get in a little bit to VPH. And we talked about this a year and a half ago when we did the UST the basics discussion. But anyone in the room have an AB 2041 compliance system that they're responsible for? I see a couple in the room. So Assembly Bill 2041 came out, and it was really born out of the requirement, really born from MTBE, and the requirement that not only are tanks liquid tight, but vapor tight. And things that kind of came from that mindset were some of your ELD testing that's been required of new installs, a tighter threshold to ensure vapor tightness upon installation. And another component of that assembly bill was the continuous monitoring of secondary containment. And It was a case of the regulation hitting the books and industry trying to catch up with a solution, a viable solution for you, the regulated community, to implement. Initially, the concept was that these continuously monitored secondary containment was going to be required for any installs after July of '03. We kind of, as we got closer to that deadline and industry, wasn't really in a position to provide a solution for you, that got pushed back another year to January of '04. So from January of '04 to now, if you were to put in a new tank system, it would have to have continuously monitored secondary containment. And just to maybe better describe what that means, in many cases, we've had double wall secondary contained tanks and piping here for years. But in most cases, let's take a dry annular of a double-walled tank. There'll be a sensor put into that interstitial space. It'll be installed at the low point. If there were a leak in the primary containment, the idea is that stored hazardous substance would flow into that interstitial space. It would activate that sensor, typically a float switch type of sensor, and the system would go into alarm. So you're effectively monitoring the primary containment in that case. However, if there was a breach of the secondary containment, unless you had a high water table or something of that nature, you might not ever know that until the SB 989 or the secondary containment testing was done every third year. So this, with AB 2041 and the continuously monitored secondary containment, now not only is that primary monitored, like it had been in the past, but the secondary is monitored as well. So industry had to come up with a solution of how to do that, not just for the tanks, but for sumps and for UDCs and the piping as well. And that ultimately bore out 3 different types of systems that can be utilized, and that's where that acronym VPH comes from, and those would be vapor pressure or hydrostatic systems. So just what you see a picture of here is actually some hydrostatic system. Those are hydrostatic fluid canisters. We'll talk about that in a second. But with a vacuum system, let's imagine that interstitial is under vacuum. So you've got a vacuum pump hooked up to, and that space is now under constant vacuum. If there was a breach of either the primary or the secondary, you're going to lose that vacuum, right? And now, once that vacuum pressure is lost, it would trigger an alarm, and you are effectively monitoring not just the primary, but the secondary containment. And the same principle applies with pressure. Just, instead of a vacuum, you have a pressure system. And the one that's and a little different is a hydrostatic system, but now instead of having a dry annular that is under either pressure or vacuum, you have a wet interstitial, so there's a hydrostatic solution in there. And that solution, if it drops below a certain level, if you start to lose that solution, that brine, as you'll hear it referred to, that's not necessarily the correct terminology for it, but the hydrostatic solution there, if you were to lose that, then it would indicate potentially that you have a leak of either the primary or secondary, and that hydrostatic fluid is escaping. Now, with these systems, as I mentioned, that the idea was that folks would be mandated to put this in '03, and it was sort of ready to do that in '04 when ultimately the regulation did come into effect, and it's been an ongoing process, kind of for this to kind of settle out and get to a point where it's these systems are better refined and the bugs, for a lack of a better term, have been worked out. With the what you see here in the brine systems, you'll have canisters like you see here, and that's where the actual sensors are located that are going to measure the level of the brine. So in a piping run, for example, if the interstitial has hydrostatic fluid in it, you'll have a sensor or a canister at the high point there, and if it starts to lose that solution, then you're going to that sensor would go into alarm. And some of the issues with that though is there have been air that gets trapped in that system, right? So you could get false alarms or burping of that hydrostatic fluid. There have been issues, as you see, a penetration here through the sump wall, where now that obviously that's in a place where that brine could escape. So there've been a lot of technical difficulties, if you will, in getting this sorted out and getting it to work correctly. But we're a lot further along now than we were 5 years ago. That's for sure. I think what's most important for the folks in this room to know is that we know that tanks installed after July 104 are going to require this, but Orange County Healthcare Agency is not going to require this of you if you do an upgrade of the system, unless that upgrade involves putting in a new tank. So if they're doing do sump collar, tank top upgrade, repipe of the system, that's not going to put you in a situation where you now have to be AB 2481 compliant and have the continuously monitored secondary containment. So that's important to note. And that's an area of that's an interpretation and what's required of Orange County Healthcare Agency, and I can't say definitively that is the same wherever you go and through different agencies, but that is the requirement here within our jurisdiction here. So any questions on these systems or any comments from those that have them? I mean, I saw a couple of show of hands here of, for those folks that do have AB 2041 compliant systems, are you having good success with those systems? Have they kind of sorted themselves out? See a sort of kind of nods out there. Yeah, I think that's kind of a truism across the industry, but if you have questions on that and would like to get a little more information or talk about some of these different systems, or maybe you're in a position where you may be subject to putting in one of these systems, I've got my cards up here, and I'll make those available. I'll put them on the back table. But if you're ever in a position where you just would have a question, maybe some clarification on something, whether it's AB 2041 related or otherwise, don't hesitate giving us a call. And if I don't know the answer, but we certainly have the resources to provide you some guidance with respect to that. And of course, from a regular storage standpoint and what's required by the agency, your inspector or anyone from Orange County Healthcare can help you with that as well. One thing to note, and Brian brought this up when we were discussing it, is if you do have a vapor or pressure system, there is a supplementary form that's required with your monitor certification. So I know that impacts a small group of you here in the room, but if you're using a V or a P system, you need to. There's a supplemental page that has to be filed with your monitoring system certification. Yes. Okay, if you don't mind me, we can have that conversation once we wrap up, and I think Brian probably has some good thoughts and ideas on that. I mentioned some of the issues, penetration failures have probably been one of the bigger ones, especially with the hydrostatic systems, and repairing those, at the beginning required, excavation surrounding the sump to try to mitigate these problems with the penetrations, and they've come up with some new methodologies of how to repair those in sump, and it's getting better and better as we move forward and we get a few years under our belt with these systems. But it continues to be somewhat problematic. So yeah, certainly could share with you our experiences of what we've deemed least problematic over the last several years. All right, we're going to talk for a few minutes about some additional hot topics or things in our conversations with Orange County Healthcare. Wanted to make sure that you all were aware of. And one of those is the change in the spill bucket testing requirements here within the agency's jurisdiction. As you're probably aware, the previous policy for spill bucket testing was that for all spill buckets, even those that were secondarily contained in a sump, that every third year they received an accelerated spill bucket test, and that's where your testing crew would come out with a measuring device, something like an Incon device, and would put it, when they did their test, would have a tighter test to determine whether or not that spill bucket was indeed liquid tight. The change in that is that now for those secondarily contained, so in other words, spill buckets that are within a fill sump, that those do not require the accelerated spill bucket test every third year, but now only require the annual lake test that's done, usually concurrent with your monitor certification, but that the annual lake testing for your spill bucket. Now, conversely, if you have a non-secondarily contained spill bucket, and boy, you don't see a whole lot of those down here. You see them left and right in Northern California, actually. But if you do have a non-secondarily contained spill bucket, then you do have to test them every year via the accelerated method. So there's more information on that at the Orange County Healthcare website, and we'll go there here in a minute, and you can take a look at some of that. And Brenda, anything to add on that?
Just a quick addition. If you have a spill sump that is not monitored, it's an unmonitored fill sump, then that would be treated the same as a direct bury spill bucket. So then you would have to test that every year with the accelerated method.
All right, and want to talk a little bit, and boy, we could have a whole a day plus presentation on alternative fuels, but this is something that is very much in flux right now. Obviously there's a big push to move towards ethanol blends and biodiesel, and and what we found is that we have clients or folks in the industry that we know that had actually installed some of these or utilizing some of these products, and then ended up having to pull those out. There've been a lot of issues with ensuring that the equipment that's used to store those, say you had you're using a diesel product, and now you want to in that same tank store biodiesel instead. There are compatibility issues there with the tank, the piping, the hanging hardware, and all of that to ensure that it is not going to be impacted by in a negative way by the biodiesel components or these ethanol blends. And it's led to, because there's not a UL standard for this, it's fallen back on the manufacturers to certify that their systems are compatible with these different blends. And it's been, constant flux as we've, kind of gone through this, that, some manufacturers are hesitant, shy of a UL standard to make that claim that their equipment is compatible with these different blends and biodiesels. Some have, and there's a desire for there to be a UL standard, but then there's issues with UL wanting these manufacturers to help fund the studies that go into developing the UL standard. So there's just a lot of back and forth right now. And to help keep that straight as we can keep it, Cal EPA has on their website put together a manual. And we'll go look at it in a second, but I think this is one of the best pages of that. And this came out in the most updated version came out in September 1st of 2010. So it's fairly recent information, but as you can see across the top, it goes through all these different, both ethanol blends and biodiesels and different blend ratios and where we're at as far as, everything from authority to regulate to production issues, vehicle issues, and gives you sort of a color-coded update as to how close we are to being able to fully implement some of these, these new alternative fuels, and is definitely a case where maybe industry got a little ahead of ourselves as far as kind of jumping into this and saying, oh, wait a second, we got to take a harder look at not only vehicle compatibility and when it comes to actual components within the vehicles and O-rings and different things within the engine itself, to the UST system as well. So I think it would be best to say that right now with ethanol blends and biodiesels, it's definitely a proceed with caution and subject to change type of status right now, for lack of a better term.